Well, hello everybody. It's Patricia Warby, Alchemy Therapies, and another update this week. I'm just going to talk a little bit about re-traumatization. I've talked a lot in the past about how events are encoded in the limbic system when you are overwhelmed as a different sort of memory, and this is called implicit memory. And it's very, very different to normal narrative memory, because it never changes over time. And so often we can get re-triggered in the present by events which remind the brain of events that actually happened to you when you were, it could be young, or when you were going through a particularly difficult time in your adult life as well. Time is not registered by this part of the brain. And so it can often be the case that it feels like an ever-present now. So I have talked about that before, but what I want to talk about today is a little bit of the neuroscience beneath re-traumatization. Some people call that re-triggering. It's the same thing. So when you have an experience, it's taken in as a series of sensory impressions. And this is particularly true of overwhelming experiences, because the context part of your brain, the prefrontal cortex and the two frontal hemispheres, actually, they kind of go offline. There's certainly decrease in blood volume, and therefore they're not easily able to take in what's happening in a contextual way. And so what happens is it's like you're really overtaken by sensations and feelings, and in the kind of meaning you're giving to something. And this is why traumatic events are so much more long-lasting in a way, because they overtake the part of the brain that normally would be able to rationalize and think things through, and therefore calm everything down. And I should say that these kind of experiences are cumulative as well. And so if they happened regularly over your childhood, for instance, or early adulthood, before your brain is fully mature around 26, 27, then they kind of have an additive effect of a sense of threat. Okay, and so some of the work that's been going on in this is largely down to the work of Ronald R Ruden. He's also a researcher, and one of the papers that he's written not so long ago, actually, is strangely titled Harnessing Electroceuticals to Treat Disorders Arising from Traumatic Stress. But the subtitle is actually more important: Theoretical Considerations Using a Psychosensory Model. Now, psychosensory is what I tend to use in my therapy with people. So we're looking at sensations in the body, we're looking at the senses rather than words and a kind of cognitive awareness. We're moving away from that into a more unconscious process. And by the way, that's why I wrote the book, Mind Medicine, which I recently published on Amazon, because I felt that wasn't really covered in a lot of the psychotherapy models that I had come across. And because I'm trained as a hypnotherapist, I actually kind of work more in a body-based way. And so a psychosensory model makes more sense to me. And I do believe it's quicker to change the imprint in the brain. And it's also longer lasting when you use the bottom-up, body-based, somatic work kind of approach. Okay, so one thing that Ronald says here is traumatically encoded memories can last a lifetime. Okay, they don't necessarily decrease because they are encoded in a part of the brain that believes you are under threat. This is your survival brain. And so it's not going to just let go and decay that memory. It's going to keep it ever present. And that actually causes the activation or the release of stress hormones, which unfortunately creates symptoms in the body because it is a persistent, what they call allostatic load. So what on earth is that? Well, allostasis refers to the body balancing itself. It's kind of things like your blood volume, the pH of your blood, the way you digest, the way your metabolism works. And your allostatic load is all the inputs that go into the kind of brain's awareness of what's going on in your environment and how it needs to move things, adjust things to keep things not exactly steady, but in a balanced manner. And so things that disrupt that message of all is well actually create a sense of, I guess, threat to the body because it has to adjust. And so we get a stress hormone release whenever something comes in to disturb this gentle kind of gradual adjustment that happens throughout the day without your awareness. And so the consequences of that is that if there's a constant release of stress hormones, it's like you're primed for threat. And therefore there's a risk that ordinary events that are non-threatening will actually be interpreted by the brain, which is already at a very high sort of level of alertness, will feel like minor things can be actually much more threatening than they are. And these these events, therefore, can be highly, highly triggering, even when they, it might be just that somebody has criticized you, or you've got an extra financial bill that you weren't expecting, but suddenly your body is taken into a sort of almost a crash or a sense of overwhelming threat. Now, for people with CFSME, the kind of chronic fatigue related disorders, this kind of re-traumatization happens every day because they're in a state of almost a freeze response, and they're being constantly overwhelmed, unbeknown to them, because this back brain response is going on unconsciously without their knowing it. Now, how this works, the neuroscience shows us that it is critical in the glutamate pathway. So glutamate is one of the neurotransmitters in your brain that kind of lays down new pathways. It kind of it encodes them. It allows them to be remembered, if you like. It sort of freezes them in a particular way, and so when glutamate is involved, it actually creates the memory consolidation, and also it allows us to re-consolidate, which is the technical term for rewiring, relaying down a new message. And one of the things that Ronald Ruden invented, if you like, was a technique called Havening, basically a self-touch exercise. Now, we knew that that released serotonin, but what we didn't realize is that it's also lighting up these glutamate pathways in your brain. And so psychosensory approaches like Havening, like tapping, I do actually believe EMDR, which is the eye movement reprocessing technique, I do believe that's similar as well, generates alpha waves in your brain, a sort of electromagnetic field which is vibrating at a lower rate than it would normally. Normally, we're in beta, busy beta. Sometimes we come down into alpha when we're feeling a bit more relaxed. That's the flow state. And it can even take us down into theta or delta waves if it's done regularly and with safe connection. Okay, so we're changing our brain waves, which is really interesting, by using these techniques and taking away this stress response. We're delinking the stress response from the brain's interpretation of what is happening. So we're depotentiating is the technical term. Okay, so it makes it less likely then that you're going to be triggered in the present. So this is very, very valuable, because then you can decrease the stress hormones and help somebody rebalance themselves, and so they're not feeling quite so overwhelmed and therefore not so fatigued. Okay, so we've talked about the allostatic load on the body, all right? Now, most treatments at the moment are often treated as disorders in the part of the body where the symptom is arising. For instance, back pain is always conceived of a problem in the back, but it's the nervous system that creates the tension in your back muscles. And the nervous system has its central control in the brain. So a lot of chronic pain is actually emotionally driven from messages of threat that the brain is receiving. And so having surgery or worse, just giving you painkillers is not going to solve the issue. So chronic unresolved anger, for instance, is also a major cause of low back pain. I know that may sound very strange to those of you who've not come across the mind-body connection before, but actually these things do play out because the nervous system is responding to signals and it's creating tension through the fascia and the muscles in your body in very specific ways. Okay, how do we deal with this? Well, we need to create this new interpretation, this new awareness of safety, safe connection. And somebody was asking me yesterday, how can we do that if we don't have anyone to work with? Well, you can do it in the mirror with yourself. So we need to understand that this isn't just a mental issue. This is translated physiologically to the cells in your body via the nervous system. It actually changes the way your DNA is read, and so it produces different proteins to what would normally be being produced in a calm body. So what we need to do then to change the input is change the way you perceive the memories, okay? Because it's all in the perception, not in the actuality. Now, when you're a child, perception is everything. You don't really have access to probably alpha states, or certainly you don't have beta states when you're young. You are really a downloading machine for experience. And therefore, you can't really work out what's going on and why. And so you'll make interpretations that aren't necessarily accurate. They're the thoughts and beliefs of a child. Okay, so we have to change that. We have to understand that traumatization can happen to anybody, can happen to a child who has a reasonable, loving family relationship, but experiences things in ways that overwhelm them easily. So it really marries with being highly sensitive. And so that's why I work a lot with people who are both highly sensitive and traumatized, because I think they're two sides of the same coin. Okay, so the event has to have a sense of overwhelm, all right? And it may not be, I should maybe mention, it may not be something that you're actually experiencing yourself. It may be something that you're aware of that's happening in your family. This is called vicarious traumatization, okay? It can even be something that you imagine or you see, like on screen, you're witnessing something, or you're being told of it by somebody who's emotionally important to you. So if one of your parents is traumatized and tells you stories about what happened to them and you find that really difficult, that can actually traumatize you as well. So we have to have the initial event that overwhelms you. Then we have to have a meaning that is sensed as threat. And that generates an emotional response. And that is what drives this sort of body encoding, if you like. It's the back brain, in fact, but it's talking to the body. Now, most of the threats that we have, honestly, aren't that we're going to die. Occasionally, people do have the threat of death. You know, if you're in surgery and your heart stops, that's for sure. If you have a really bad accident, that's another typical, what I would call a big T trauma. But most threats that people perceive are actually small t emotional traumas, and they are a threatened loss of attachment. This is where most of us get our sense of threat from, because as a child, if we lose attachment, that does mean death to a child. And there are structures in our body, innate structures, that know this. And so in order to overcome this, we have to create a new sense of attachment. Okay, and so that's why working one-to-one with someone, or working in the mirror or in a group setting, is really, really important. So we've got the threat, the event itself, either witnessed or experienced. We've got the meaning that you make of that. You know, I'm not lovable, for instance, or everything I do is wrong, because children will blame themselves always. And then what you need to have is a vulnerable landscape. So that's the highly sensitive bit. All right, that's the bit where your brain is already primed for threat. And that can come about because maybe you had a sensitive or very stressed parent, particularly mum. She's very important because you share the same blood supply when you're in the womb. Maybe you had a difficult birth, or perhaps you were adopted, you were given up. There is a thing called relinquishment trauma, which we're just becoming aware of. Even though you have no conscious recall of that because you were too young, this back brain does remember that, and it translates as a threat sense in the body. So a vulnerable landscape is the third element, okay? And that is really important. And the fourth is inescapability, all right? So something can be overwhelming, threatening, and you might have a vulnerability, but if you're able to flee the situation or fight the situation, that does not therefore become traumatically encoded. But as children or young adults, we often do not have the resources we have when we're older. And it may be that we can't fight or we can't flee because we know instinctively both of those would make things worse. And so we learn perhaps to people please or to suppress our emotional needs in order to stay attached. Okay, so perceived inescapability is the fourth. And I guess that is really the most difficult one to change, because that's not something as a child you can often change your situation. But what's really, I think, fascinating is that we can recreate a new ending. All right, we can create a new ending to what actually happened, where you do escape, or you go back as your adult self and you allow the adult you to save the younger you. And believe it or not, that overrides the memory of the traumatization. And so those are the kinds of things that I work with in my clinic. Those are the kinds of approaches I do. I work very much through the body with the unconscious, with this kind of somatic imprint of psychosensory traumatization. So if that sounds interesting to you, I would love it if you get in touch. We have a group program just launching in October called the Emotional Audit. It's a 8-week program. Well, it's 10 weeks altogether, but it's 8 weeks of taught content and with 7 live sessions with me. If you're interested, you can find details on alchemytherapies.co.uk. And if you'd like to come and work with me, you can contact me there as well. Take care, everyone. I'll be following up next week with a little bit more on this very important information. Bye for now. Bye-bye.